They told him the enemy wasn't human. One choice.
Drop your country name in the comments below and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The unit stopped moving. Ayo heard it then, footsteps breaking through undergrowth, careless and rushed. Someone was fleeing the bombardment zone alone. His commander pointed at Ayo and two others, then gestured toward the sound. They moved as one organism, weapons raised, safety switches clicked off. The figure stumbled into the clearing 20 meters ahead. Small frame, dark tactical gear, no visible weapon. Ayo's night vision scope revealed exhausted movements and a hand clutched against the ribcage. Blood seeped between the fingers. The person turned and moonlight caught the face. Korean features, female, young, eyes wide with the specific terror of someone who knows death is seconds away. His commander's voice came through the radio earpiece. Eliminate and move on. Standard procedure, no prisoners, no complications. Ayo raised his rifle and centered the crosshairs on her chest. His finger found the trigger. He had done this before. It should have been automatic. But she did something unexpected. Instead of running or begging, she straightened her spine and stared directly at him. Not defiant exactly, not surrendering either. That expression cut through his training like a blade through cloth. Ayo made a decision that would destroy everything. He fired 3 shots into the trees behind her and shouted contact, lost into his radio. His unit moved on to pursue other targets. He waited until their footsteps faded, then approached the woman with his weapon lowered. She swayed on her feet, watching him with confusion and residual fear. He pressed a finger to his lips, then gestured for her to follow. They moved away from the conflict zone, deeper into territory neither side controlled. The woman, he would later learn her name was Min Jae, collapsed after 2 kilometers. Ayo caught her before she hit the ground and dragged her into a cave formation he had scouted during daylight patrol. He lit no fire. He spoke no words. He simply applied field dressings to her wounds, using supplies from both their medical kits. She regained consciousness near dawn and immediately reached for a weapon that was no longer there. Ayo sat across from her with his rifle disassembled for cleaning, showing her he was not preparing to kill her immediately. She stared at him with questions she could not ask. He had questions too, but neither spoke the other's language well enough for answers. The first day passed in tense silence. Ayo left her tied loosely to a rock formation while he gathered water and checked perimeter security. When he returned, she had not attempted escape. She drank when he offered water. She ate the protein bars he provided. She studied him the way a person studies something that defies explanation. By the second day, they began communicating through gestures and broken English phrases. She pointed at herself and said Min Jae clearly. He did the same with his name. She pointed at his flag patch and made a questioning expression. He pointed at hers and shrugged. The message was clear. Neither of them knew why they were really here. That moment of shared confusion created the first crack in the wall between them. On the third day, mortar fire drove them deeper into the cave system. They huddled together as the earth shook and dust rained from the ceiling. Min Jae's wound had reopened from the movement. Ayo rebandaged it, while explosions thundered outside. Their faces were inches apart in the darkness. He could feel her breath on his neck. She could feel his hands trembling slightly as he worked. Something shifted between them that had nothing to do with war or nationality. The fourth day brought rain that lasted 16 hours. They could not risk exposure or movement. Ayo shared his remaining rations. Min Jae offered half of her emergency chocolate. They sat side by side and watched water cascade across the cave entrance. She began speaking softly in Korean, not expecting him to understand, just needing to hear human words. He responded in Swahili, offering his own thoughts to the air. Neither understood the other's language, but both understood the loneliness. By the 5th day, Min Jae could walk without support. Ayo knew he should make a decision, return her to her unit under some diplomatic pretense, turn her over to his commanders as a prisoner, or simply leave her with supplies and disappear. Instead, he did none of these things. They stayed in the cave. They began teaching each other words. On the 7th day, they heard helicopters searching the area. Both of them froze. If either side found them together, explanations would not matter. Execution would be swift and certain. Io grabbed Minjae's hand without thinking and pulled her deeper into the cave network. They pressed themselves into a crevice barely wide enough for two bodies and held their breath as rotors thundered overhead. Her hand stayed in his after the danger passed. Neither of them pulled away. They emerged from the crevice and looked at each other with new recognition. This was no longer about capture or mercy or strategic advantage. This was about two people who had stopped being enemies and started being something neither had permission to become. The war ended on a Tuesday with no warning. Io woke to silence. No distant artillery, no helicopter patrols, no radio chatter. He checked his equipment 3 times, thinking it had malfunctioned. Minjae stirred beside him and immediately sensed the wrongness. They climbed to the cave entrance and scanned the horizon. The mining camps showed no activity. The military positions were abandoned. Smoke still rose from previous bombardments, but no new explosions followed. His radio crackled once with a simple message. Return to extraction point immediately. Bring nothing. Speak to no one. Further instructions upon arrival. Then static. Minjae's radio delivered a similar message in Korean. They looked at each other with the understanding that something larger than both of them had decided their fates. They had spent 11 days together. 11 days of sharing food and fear and gradually opening spaces in themselves they had kept locked. They had learned to communicate in a hybrid language of English fragments, hand gestures, and the kind of understanding that grows between people who have saved each other's lives. On the 9th day, Io had kissed her. On the 10th day, she had told him she wanted to survive the war so they could choose what came next together. On the 11th day, the war simply stopped existing. Neither spoke as they gathered their minimal belongings. What could they say? They had no plan for this scenario. They had imagined the war ending with ceremony, with negotiations, with time to make arrangements. They had whispered about finding each other afterward, about building something real away from bullets and lies. They had been naive. Io walked Minjae to within sight of her extraction point. They stopped behind a ridge where no one could see them. She turned to face him and placed both hands on his chest. He covered her hands with his own. They stood like that for long minutes, memorizing each other's faces. She gave him a small piece of paper with an email address written in careful English. He gave her his mother's address in Dar es Salaam. They both knew these gestures were probably meaningless, but they needed to believe in possibility. She left first, walking toward the Korean transport vehicles without looking back. Io watched until she disappeared into the convoy, then turned toward his own extraction point. His mind replayed every moment of the past 11 days, the way she had looked at him with trust instead of fear, the sound of her laughter when he had tried to pronounce Korean words, the feeling of her hand gripping his during the helicopter search. He walked faster, trying to outpace the certainty that he would never see her again. The extraction went exactly as ordered, efficient, silent, final. Ao and his unit were loaded into unmarked trucks, transported to an airfield, and flown to a base in Uganda. There, military contractors wearing no identifying insignia confiscated every piece of equipment, every document, every photograph. They were debriefed individually in rooms with no windows. Io lied smoothly. He reported nothing unusual. He described routine patrols and standard engagements. He mentioned no caves, no injuries, no Korean woman who had changed everything. The interrogator watched him with flat eyes that suggested he knew some version of truth was being withheld. But proof was impossible, so Ao was processed and released. He returned to Tanzania 3 weeks after the war ended. His family welcomed him home with celebration and questions. He told them almost nothing. That he checked his email 17 times per day, hoping for a message that never came. The veteran benefits he had been promised did not exist. When he inquired at government offices, clerks looked at him with confusion. There was no record of his deployment. The contracting company that had recruited him had dissolved. The bank account where his pay had been deposited was closed. It was as if the entire operation had been a dream, except for the scars on his body and the ache in his chest. 4 months passed. Ao found work as a security guard at a shopping center. He lived with his mother and sent money to his sisters. He existed, but did not live. Every Asian woman he saw from a distance made his heart accelerate. Every news report about international tensions made him scan for coded references to the conflict that had consumed half a year of his life. Min-jae faced similar erasure in Seoul. She had been transported from the extraction point to a military facility where she endured 2 weeks of isolation and interrogation. Officers told her clearly that the operation had never occurred. Any attempt to claim veteran status would be treated as evidence of mental instability. Any attempt to contact former unit members would be investigated as potential treason. She signed documents she was not allowed to read and was released with a warning that her family's safety depended on her silence. She returned to civilian life in a country that had no space for her experience. Her parents wanted her to resume the path she had been on before enlistment: find suitable employment, meet appropriate men, prepare for marriage and family. She went through motions without conviction. She thought about Io constantly. She had memorized the address he had given her, but was afraid to use it. What if letters were intercepted? What if her attempt to reach him endangered his family? She took a job at a telecommunications company. She rented a small apartment. She told her parents she needed time before considering marriage. At night she lay awake remembering the sound of Io's voice in the darkness, the warmth of his hand, the way he had looked at her as if she was worth saving. She wondered if he remembered her the same way, or if he had moved on to safer affections. 3 years evaporated. Io turned 26 and felt 40. Min-jae turned 25 and stopped counting. Neither dated seriously. Neither spoke about the war. Then the conference invitation arrived. Ao received it through a former unit member who had also been part of the Ghost War. The message was cryptic: an international security conference in Geneva, expenses paid, attendance encouraged for those who understood why. Min-jae received a similar invitation through a Korean veterans network that existed in the shadows. The conference promised to address unacknowledged military operations and the legal status of involved personnel. The conference center in Geneva was anonymous and modern. 200 people attended, representing 30 countries. Most looked like Io and Min-jae, young veterans with old eyes, people who had fought wars their governments refused to acknowledge. The sessions discussed international law, corporate military contracts, and the legal gray zones where people disappeared. Io saw her on the second day during a break between panels. She was standing near a window, reading her conference program. The afternoon light caught her profile. 3 years had added sharpness to her features, but had not changed the essential shape of who she was. His heart stopped, then restarted with painful force. He approached slowly, afraid she would not remember him or would not want to. She looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then she smiled, small and uncertain, but real. They found a quiet corner and talked for 3 hours. Both had survived, both had been erased, both had spent 3 years carrying the same questions. They compared notes on their debriefings and realized the patterns were identical across nationalities. The war had been designed to be forgotten. The people who fought it were meant to disappear quietly into civilian life without making noise or demanding recognition. Over the next 2 days, they attended sessions together and met others who had fought in the same region. Details emerged. The conflict had been funded by a consortium of mining corporations and backed tacitly by governments who wanted strategic resources without official military commitments. Soldiers had been rotated through quickly to minimize unit cohesion and loyalty. Anyone who formed relationships across enemy lines, romantic or otherwise, was flagged as a security risk. On the final evening of the conference, Min-jae found documents posted anonymously on a secure forum. They proved what everyone had suspected. The war had been manufactured and sustained deliberately. Soldiers had been recruited from countries with weak veteran advocacy systems. The whole operation had been designed to self-destruct without leaving evidence or obligations. She showed the documents to Io in her hotel room. They sat side by side on the edge of the bed and read through pages of corporate memos, financial transfers, and surveillance reports. Min-jae and Io sat in the hotel room with the documents spread between them like evidence at a trial. The security directive was clear. Any soldier who formed personal connections across enemy lines was to be eliminated quietly. The justification was operational security, but the real reason was simpler. Love between enemies proved the war was a lie, and lies that expensive could not tolerate truth. They had been flagged 3 years ago. Io remembered the interrogator's flat eyes. Min-jae remembered questions that seemed to probe beyond what she had revealed. They had both been lucky. Their interrogators had been lazy or overwhelmed or simply unable to prove what they suspected. But now, by attending the same conference and being seen together, they had almost certainly triggered new surveillance. Io stood and walked to the window. Geneva spread below them, neutral and expensive and safe. He thought about his mother in Dar es Salaam and his sisters who depended on his income. He thought about the quiet life he had built from wreckage. He could walk away right now, return home, and probably live without further consequence. The smart choice was obvious. Min-jae joined him at the window. She had been thinking parallel thoughts about her parents, her job, the small apartment that represented hard-won independence. She could thank Ao for the conversation, exchange contact information she would never use, and disappear back into the life that had been assigned to her. The reasonable choice was clear. Neither of them moved toward that choice. They had spent 3 years as ghosts. They had accepted erasure because resistance seemed impossible. But seeing each other again had reminded them they were still alive, still capable of choosing, still deserving of something more than survival. Io turned from the window and took Min-jae's hands. He spoke slowly in English. They had both improved over the years. He told her he had tried to forget her. He told her he had failed completely. He told her he would rather have 6 months of truth with her than 50 years of safe lies without her. His voice shook, but his hands were steady. Min-jae answered in the same careful English. She told him she had memorized his address, but had been too afraid to use it. She told him she had compared every man she met to him and found them all insufficient. She told him she wanted to build a life where they could both be real. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was clear. They spent that night making plans. Not romantic plans, practical ones. They identified 3 problems. First, returning to their home countries would mean living under surveillance or worse. Second, attempting to expose the war would likely result in their arrest or disappearance. Third, existing as they were, separate and erased, was not living at all. The next morning, they met with 2 other conference attendees who had formed similar bonds during the Ghost War. One was a Brazilian medic who had fallen in love with a Filipino engineer. The other was a Ghanaian logistics officer who had developed a deep friendship with a Vietnamese translator. All of them had been flagged. All of them understood they were living on borrowed time. Together, they created a plan that was part escape and part rebellion. They would not expose the war through public channels. That would accomplish nothing except their own destruction. Instead, they would quietly disappear from their old lives and establish new identities in countries that asked few questions and had strong privacy protections. They would document everything they knew and place it with trusted journalists and lawyers with instructions to publish only if they were harmed. It was not justice, but it was survival with dignity. Over the next 6 months, they executed the plan carefully. Ao told his family he had received a job offer in Mozambique. He sent money home regularly, but provided no forwarding address. Min-jae told her parents she was pursuing graduate studies abroad. She video called them weekly from internet cafes, maintaining the fiction while building the truth. They met in Uruguay first, a country with strong asylum traditions and minimal interest in foreign conflicts. They lived separately for 3 months while establishing paper trails and building local identities. They were careful, patient, and terrified. Every unexpected knock on the door felt like the end. Every stranger who looked twice felt like surveillance. But nothing happened. The war that had erased them was too busy erasing itself to chase every ghost. After 6 months in Uruguay, they moved to Portugal, which offered paths to residency for those willing to invest modest amounts in local businesses. Io used his engineering background to find work with a construction company. Min-jae used her telecommunications experience to freelance as a technical consultant. They lived quietly, avoided attention, and slowly built something that resembled a life. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 years after the war had ended, they walked into a civil registry office in Lisbon. They carried documentation proving they were who they claimed to be. even if those claims were carefully constructed fictions. They applied for a marriage license under names that would never appear in any military database. The clerk processed their application with bored efficiency. There was no ceremony, no celebration, no family present. Just two people who had been through war and erasure and years of separation choosing to legally bind themselves together. The clerk stamped their documents and told them to return in 30 days for the final certificate. They walked out into Portuguese sunlight and stood on the sidewalk, trying to process what they had done. It was not the marriage either of them had imagined. No traditional wedding with family and community blessing. No romantic destination ceremony. Just a bureaucratic transaction in a country neither had been born in, under names neither had been given, witnessed by no one who knew their real stories. The wedding took place 32 days later in a small room with two witnesses pulled from a coffee shop next door. Minjai wore a simple blue dress. Ayo wore his best shirt and borrowed tie. The officiant read the ceremony in Portuguese while they responded with phrases they had practiced. When it was done, they were legally married under the laws of Portugal and the European Union. They celebrated with the two coffee shop witnesses at a neighborhood restaurant. The witnesses had no idea they were helping mark the end of one story and the beginning of another. They simply enjoyed free dinner with a young couple who seemed very happy and slightly lost. That night, in the small apartment they had rented together, Minjay and Ayo lay awake talking about the future they had built from wreckage. They would never return to Tanzania or Korea. They would never reclaim their military service or demand recognition for their sacrifices. They would live under assumed names in a country that was not home but had become a refuge. They talked about starting a small business together, maybe a cafe or a bookshop. But they also talked about remembering. They would never forget the cave where they had learned to see each other as human. They would never forget the 11 days that had destroyed and remade them. Minjay fell asleep first, her head on Ayo's shoulder. He lay awake watching her breathe and thinking about the improbability of their survival. So many things could have gone differently. He could have pulled the trigger that first night. She could have died from her wounds. They could have been discovered in the cave. They could have never received the conference invitations. They could have chosen safety over truth at any of a dozen decision points. But they had not. They had made different choices at every turn, choices that were foolish and dangerous and ultimately right. They had refused to let the war define them. They had refused to accept erasure. They had insisted on being real even when reality was expensive and complicated and scary. As dawn light began filtering through the apartment windows, Ayo finally drifted towards sleep. His last conscious thought was simple and profound. They had won. Not the war. The war would never have winners. But they had won something more important. They had won the right to choose who they became after violence ended. They had won the right to love someone the world had told them to hate. They had won the right to build a small, quiet, ordinary life that was entirely their own. The history books would never record their war. The governments would never acknowledge their service. The corporations would never compensate their trauma. But none of that mattered anymore. They had written their own ending in a civil registry office in Lisbon. They had married each other under the names they had chosen in the country they had chosen while building the future they had chosen. It was not the ending anyone would have predicted. It was not triumphant or dramatic or neat. But it was theirs. And after everything they had survived, that was enough.